The release of Call of Duty Modern Warfare in 2019 was met with high praise and a breath of fresh air. Call of Duty campaigns were finally good again. But wait, what was it in the first place that caused Call of Duty campaigns to have a downhill spiral? Before the release of the original Modern Warfare, Call of Duty campaigns solely focused on recreating the United States' campaign in Europe in World War II. These games focused on recreating the battles that, players would forge across Europe from World War II, and they recreated these things like Point du Hoc, Normandy, the parachute drops of the 101st Airborne, stuff like that. These games featured stories of soldiers forging battles across Europe to fight the German armies and take land back from Germany, fighting more and more all the way towards Berlin. While some certainly didn't have the best graphics, all of the pre-Modern Warfare games of Call of Duty were received very well, both critically and from the public. A big part of these games was the epic grand scales of World War II battles that these games were able to recreate. Being that these games came right after the release of Saving Private Ryan, gamers were itching to get a feel of how that epic opening beach sequence would feel played through in a video game and how they could have an interactive experience with that. And while the only Call of Duty game that actually featured the Omaha Beach sequence was Call of Duty 2 Big Red 1, the games would still recreate the spirit of that opening sequence in the battles themselves that they were able to recreate. But then everything changed. In 2007, Infinity Ward and Treyarch released Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Call of Duty 4 introduced a type of warfare that people had never really seen in a Call of Duty game. Instead of being part of this massive army forging battle across Europe, with these massive engagements, you're now instead part of a 4 or 5 man small tactical team that is making tactical insertions throughout the globe, fighting your enemies one mission at a time. No longer were you a grunt in an army fighting another army. Instead, truthful to how warfare is conducted nowadays, you're now going for the head of the serpent instead of the body, which in the case of Call of Duty 4 would be Imran Zakhaev. Warfare nowadays focuses more on taking out the leaders of the opposing army instead of just attacking the army itself and, taking ground back from their army, which was how warfare was fought in World War II. It was about taking ground away and advancing through enemy territory. But when fans got to play Modern Warfare, they lost their minds. This game was incredibly well received on all levels, and it really changed the Call of Duty franchise forever. Call of Duty had made a seamless transition from World War II combat to combat as it exists today, and gamers could not wait to see what was going to come next.
It's time to jump up in the air. Jump up, don't be scared. Jump up and your cares will soar away. And if the dark clouds searches worlds, don't feel a shed a tear, 'cause I'll be your one-up girl.
Yet, when we did see what came next, we were all just incredibly disappointed. One game after another, it felt like every Call of Duty game we were given became increasingly disappointing. So much so that when the announcement trailer for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare was released, it became one of the most disliked videos in YouTube history, with fans completely turning on the franchise. So what happened? Why all of a sudden were we now sick and tired of the new direction that Call of Duty was taking? Could it be that fans were sick of the overly powerful and super futuristic technologies featured in the games? Sure. Could it have been that campaigns were shoved into the background of development as multiplayer mode became increasingly more important in the community? Maybe. But if we really want to find out how the slow and more drawn-out decline of Call of Duty campaigns happened, I think the answer lies in just 2 words: dynamic storytelling. To better explain dynamic storytelling, I first want to show you this. This is a narrative arc graph, and it details the basic principles of storytelling. Essentially, every good story follows the basic principles of this graph. At the start, your story needs some amount of exposition, which includes the setup of the plot and an inciting incident. An inciting incident is an event or moment which pushes your protagonist into the story to the point of no return. The funny thing is, most Call of Duty games don't have an inciting incident, as at the beginning of the game, you're already in a war with somebody. Even Call of Duty 4 didn't really have one. After the inciting incident though, there comes the rising action, which is where the story grows in intensity until it reaches the climax, which is the point of the story where it reaches its height of intensity or suspense or whatever emotion has been predominating the story, really. After this climax, there should be some sort of falling action where things get better for the hero of the story, the intensity dies down, and things become more stable for our protagonist. After this usually short period of falling action, we then got a resolution, which shows what the result for the protagonist is after they have overcome, or not overcome, the big conflict of the story. While this graph is an ideal, perfect example of the narrative arc, it definitely goes without saying that most stories do not and should not be expected to perfectly follow the curves in this graph. The beauty of storytelling is that for a protagonist to get to the peak of the climax of the story, it's not always a steady climb to the top. There's usually a lot of bumps in the road or downward curves that happen along the way, and seeing the protagonist or hero overcome these things is what makes us root for them even more to get to the resolution. That being said, when Call of Duty doesn't follow the curve in this graph, which it shouldn't be expected to, it's in the absolute worst way possible. Let's take this graph and scale it from 0 to 100 in terms of action/intensity. Usually a story starts out at 0, rises a bit to 20, then climbs up to a climax at 100, making a series of, downward dips and upward rises along the way. Then we fall back down to 20 with the falling action and reach 0 again at the resolution. Call of Duty storylines take the norm and blow it right out of the fucking galaxy! These games start all the way at an intensity of 80 and just keep going all the way up to 100 because they're so batshit fucking insane! Actually, fuck it! Let's take this baby up to 110, 120, 150, all the way into space! You get my point. These games start off at a super high level of intensity and never die down. They just get more and more and more intense until you get to the climax of the story during the last mission, and then boom, it goes down to 0 and the campaign's over. Their curve is literally a straight line to 100 and then a steep drop down to 0. So what does this have to do with the decline of Call of Duty? Well, it has to do with the fact that gamers who play Call of Duty began to become increasingly desensitized to the massive explosions, grenades, and tanks blowing the absolute shit out of buildings, and attack drones raising absolute hellfire down on your enemies, and the absolute insanity! Dynamic storytelling is about using this narrative arc in a way to tell a story where it has many highs and lows throughout. This can be in terms of action, emotion, or even plot progression. But it's separating the high points of a story with low points to keep that action feeling fresh. If we see massive explosions and gunfire and large-scale battles all the time, you don't get like a break from it. It just becomes so bland because that's all we're getting. You need to have downtime that's slow, interesting, but slower than, the batshit insanity. In between those high points of batshit insanity, because that's what's gonna make the crazy feel crazy. And if we see a character win all the time, or be perfect in overcoming their conflict all the time, then we never feel like there's any risk involved with that character at all. It's when we see a character fail during points in a story where we start to doubt whether they'll come out on top by the end of that story, and this is where the gates open for us to feel a wide array of emotions throughout a story in association with the protagonist. This is exactly what people loved about the Call of Duty campaigns of the early 2000s. You saw your squad mates die.
McCullen told me to tell you.
You're not dying like him.
He told me to tell you. You should go to hell.
Stay with me,
But you're
Diggs.
okay, Guzzo.
Diggs.
You're okay.
Come on, buddy. God damn it.
You didn't have access to an unlimited amount of firepower. You could actually run out of ammo. Not every battle was a massive slaughterhouse with immense destruction. even in the early World War II Call of Duty games. And not every victory was easy. Some battles were very hard to win, in fact. But it's the low points in a story that, make us feel vulnerable and keep the destructive, high-octane battles feeling exciting and epic. It says a lot that one of the most popular missions in the new Modern Warfare is a mission called Clean House, which involves a small team of operatives infiltrating a townhouse in England that's filled with small but armed terrorist cell operatives. The beauty of this mission, I feel, lies in its simplicity, and also the fact that it lets us take a step back from, the usual craziness of how Call of Duty missions are. It's a dip in the action that's still fun and allows for fun gameplay to be had. Clean House is also great because it does capture the realism of modern day battles.
Flash out from 2C. Roger, moving.
And for a very long time, Call of Duty games seem to just completely forget this and just seem to be trying to top last year's game for how insane the action could be or how high-tech the gear could be. And this isn't what gamers wanted or liked about Call of Duty campaigns. It's not a competition with last year's game. Sure, it was able to get away with these things in the early Call of Duty World War II games, but that's because the characters were so lovable.
Whose brilliant plan was this?
General George S. Patton. You got some kind of problem with him too?
Nope. So long as the orders aren't coming from McCollum.
Ain't no orders coming from him. Hell, he said so much as a word for 2 days straight.
And at that point, this was a new thing for technology and in video games. So it was a brand new thing, so I feel like that's kind of why they could get away with it. That relative newness and the fact that we had never really seen battles of World War II recreated in a video game at this scale and at this graphic quality. I feel like that was something that was amazing and cool and even fresh for gamers at the time. But after a decade of this, I'm sorry, it's bound to get old and repetitive. Especially after we got the campaign of Call of Duty 4, which did have, lulls in the action with more stealthful tactical missions, such as Crew Expendable, The Hunted, All Gillied Up, and Ultimatum. It's these slower paced missions that have sparse amounts of action that allow for other, missions such as The Bog, War Pig, and Shock and Awe that involve large-scale destructive battles to actually feel cool and feel exciting. For example, The Bog and War Pig both involve a big, highly fierce battles where you play as a US Marine fighting through a large force of enemies in order to reach and rescue a tank crew. Between these two missions is another one I've mentioned called The Hunted, where you play as an SAS operative named Soap, evading chopper and ground patrols searching for you after your helicopter has crashed. While there is still fighting in this mission, the priority is on stealth and evasion. When you do fight, it's only against smaller patrols except for one instance where you're forced to flee a bit larger of a patrol force. Breaking up the more extreme missions that Call of Duty is used to with small, stealthful, tactical missions is what creates dynamic storytelling. This allows us to feel as if every mission we play through has a freshness to it compared to the one that we previously played. Now, don't get me wrong, there's multiple other things wrong with Call of Duty besides this. But if we're to answer the question of how we've become so desensitized to these big-scaled, extreme battles that are featured in Call of Duty campaigns, I think the answer lies in the lack of dynamic storytelling. Think back to the sequel Modern Warfare 3 and think of the missions, and try and tell me any of the missions that stood out to you as being, the best or ones that you've loved. I don't know about you, but for me, there really are none, and that's because every mission basically felt exactly the same. They all have, your 3 or 4 man squad going through a city and mowing down hundreds of enemies with seemingly unlimited amounts of firepower. Without any breaks in intensity in Call of Duty game after Call of Duty game, the gameplay begins to just feel stale, and we lose the ability to have any emotional impact by seeing these, massive scaled battles in Call of Duty anymore. Let me know what you think about how Call of Duty campaigns have evolved in the comments below. Do you think that dynamic storytelling does play a factor in the decline of Call of Duty campaigns? Or do you think that Call of Duty campaigns haven't declined at all? Do you like the new direction of the Call of Duty campaigns? I may make another video going over all of the problems in a more broad scale of the Call of Duty games and campaigns, but for today, just dynamic storytelling. As usual, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in future videos. Bye-bye, everybody.